The Middle East, which produces over 30% of global oil, is on the edge. For the first time in decades, Israel, Iran, and the US are in direct conflict. We are seeing reports of a ceasefire, but attacks continue. If this escalates, India could be hit hard. Over half of its energy supplies depend on routes that are now under threat. So, what does this conflict mean for the global economy and India's markets? We break this down on today's episode of Cut the Noise. With a deep understanding of the financial markets, joining me today is Vaibhav Ladda, CEO of Grip Invest. Welcome to Cut the Noise, Vaibhav.
Thank you so much, Divyani.
I want to know from you, what impact does the Iran-Israel conflict have on the global economy?
All wars have some impact on the global economy.
Yeah.
However, there are conflicts which are more contained within a region. For example, Russia-Ukraine. However, this conflict between Iran and Israel is particularly important because two things have happened. One, this is a very, very critical oil producing region, and oil imports and exports would affect a larger global economy. And second, as the US has got involved with the direct bombing of Iran, the scale of this conflict has become truly global. And in retaliation to the US attack, Iran has now threatened to close down the Strait of Hormuz, which could hugely destabilize the oil movement in the region.
Can you tell me why is the Strait of Hormuz so important, and could it impact India?
Yeah, so it is important to understand the geography of Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz is a narrow choke point which Iran controls around the Persian Gulf. The important aspect about this is that 20% of global oil, which is a lot, moves through this small narrow Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
If that gets choked by Iran, then the supply and the transport of oil would become destabilized, and the suppliers will have to find newer ways to transport the same oil.
Right.
Which would maybe mean moving around the Horn of Africa. That means increase in shipping costs and so on.
Right.
Now, when it comes to India, India doesn't import so much from Iran, but I think 50 to 60% of India's imports still come from that region of Middle East suppliers. And it becomes very, very important for India because 80 to 85% of India's crude oil requirements are met through imports. If the oil prices increase, our imports in terms of the dollar value of our imports would increase, which would lead to the current account deficit if the conflict still drags on.
How are the markets reacting to this conflict?
Markets surprisingly are not reacting very in a panic state. I think markets are still resilient towards the entire conflict. Not just Indian markets, but I think even Iranian markets and Israeli markets are continuing to hold on. The situation is still unfolding, but the conflict has not resulted in an equity panic selling.
Right.
However, Indian investors should be cautious of what I earlier mentioned about increase in oil prices, increase in inflation, which would result in or it should be a cautious market from here on.
What's surprising is that I was reading how the Israel stock exchange has been attacked by Iran in this war, and still the Israeli stock market is not showing any signs of going down. It's actually rising.
So not just Israeli, but my personal view on this, and it's not an expert view, but globally the markets continue to be resilient. The big determinant of that could be the faith that people still have across the globe that this conflict would not escalate indefinitely, and the truce could be around the corner, and then the market resilience will continue.
And now coming back to India's markets, why do you think India's markets are showing resilience?
Again, one, the sentimental view that we just spoke about, but I think the more objective view there is that the trade between Iran and India is not so significant.
Right.
Most of our oil imports come from Saudi and UAE versus Iran. The Indian macros, we have seen time and again that domestic flows to the markets have shown extreme resilience over several macro events. Even during FII sell-offs, Indian domestic inflows have continue to keep the markets afloat. The inflation is in control right now, and hence we saw the repo rate cuts as well, which also leads to a strong economic market. Lastly, US has large strategic reserves where India's imports come from, besides the Middle East, and that will also continue to keep Indian markets in good stead. Having said all of that, things could change radically here. The scale of the conflict is really important, and the investors should be cautious.
That's all the time we have today, Vaibhav. Your insights were incredibly helpful. Thank you for joining Cut the Noise.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. To everyone watching, this was Cut the Noise. If you have any questions regarding the impact of this war, drop them in the comments. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Investments in debt securities, municipal debt securities, securitized debt instruments are subject to risks including delay and or default in payment. Read all the offer related documents carefully.